Dear students, after studying this module, you shall be able to learn the anatomy and blood supply of the brain, learn the basic role of various neurotransmitters, learn the major chemical systems including dopamine, epinephrine, GABA and serotonin. A brief note on the anatomy of brain. The three main components of the brain, the cerebrum, the cerebellum and the brainstem have distinct functions. The cerebrum is the largest and the most developmentally advanced part of the human brain. It is responsible for several higher functions including higher intellectual function, speech, emotion, integration of sensory stimuli of all types, initiation of the final common pathways for movement and fine control of movement. The cerebellum, the second largest area, is responsible for maintaining balance and further control of movement and coordination. The brainstem is the final pathway between cerebral structures and the spinal cord. It is responsible for a variety of automatic functions such as control of respiration, heart rate and blood pressure, wakefulness, arousal and attention. The cerebrum is divided into a right and a left hemisphere and is composed of pairs of frontal, parietal, temporal and occipital lobes. The left hemisphere controls the majority of functions on the right side of the body, while the right hemisphere controls most of the functions of the left side of the body. The crossing of nerve fibers takes place in the brainstem. Thus, injury to the left cerebral hemisphere produces sensory and motor deficits on the right side and vice versa. One hemisphere has a slightly more developed or dominant area in which written and spoken language is organized. Over 95% of right-handed people and even the majority of left-handed people have dominance for speech and language in the left hemisphere. Thus, a left hemisphere stroke will be more likely to produce aphasia, that is, loss of speech and other language deficits. Layers of cerebrum, grey and white matter. The entire cerebrum is composed of two layers. The 20 mm thick outermost layer called the cerebral cortex or grey matter contains the center of cognition and personality and the coordination of complicated movements. The grey matter is also organized for different functions. The white matter is a network of fibers that enables regions of the brain to communicate with each other. Cerebellum and brainstem. A stroke involving the cerebellum may result in the lack of coordination, clumsiness, shaking or other muscular difficulties. These are important to diagnose early since swelling may cause brainstem compression or hydrocephalus. Strokes in the brainstem are usually due to basilar occlusion, that is, blockage of blood vessel, usually due to a clot, although in many cases the clinical syndrome may fit the criteria for a lacunar stroke. Brainstem strokes can be serious or even fatal. People who survive may be left with severe impairments or remain in a vegetative state. Major blood vessels. Normal function of the brain's control center is dependent upon adequate supply of oxygen and nutrients through a dense network of blood vessels. Blood is supplied to the brain, face and scalp via two major sets of vessels, the right and the left common carotid arteries and the right and the left vertebral arteries. The common carotid arteries have two divisions. The external carotid arteries supply the face and the scalp with blood. The internal carotid arteries supply blood to the anterior 3/5 of cerebrum. The vertebra basal arteries supply the posterior 2/5 of the cerebrum, part of cerebellum and the brainstem. Any decrease in the flow of blood through one of the internal carotid arteries brings about some impairment in the function of the frontal lobes. This impairment may result in numbness, weakness or paralysis on the side of the body opposite to the obstruction of the artery. Occlusion of one of the vertebral arteries may cause many serious consequences ranging from blindness to paralysis. Circle of Willis. At the base of the brain, the carotid and vertebra basal arteries form a circle of communicating arteries known as the circle of Willis. From this circle, other arteries, the anterior cerebral artery ACA and the middle cerebral artery MCA, the posterior cerebral artery PCA, arise and travel to all parts of the brain. Because the carotid and vertebra basal arteries form a circle, if one of the brain arteries is occluded, the distal smaller arteries that it supplies can receive blood from the other arteries, which is known as the contralateral circulation. The anterior cerebral artery extends upwards and forward from the internal carotid artery. It supplies the frontal lobes, the parts of the brain that control logical thought, personality and voluntary movements, especially of the legs. Middle cerebral artery. The middle cerebral artery is the largest branch of the internal carotid. The artery supplies primary motor and sensory areas of the face, throat, arm and hand, and in the dominant hemisphere, the areas for speech. The middle cerebral artery is the artery most often occluded in stroke. Posterior cerebral artery. The posterior cerebral arteries stem in most individuals from the basilar artery, but sometimes originate from the ipsilateral, which is of the same side, internal carotid artery. The posterior artery supplies the temporal and occipital lobes of the left cerebral hemisphere and right hemisphere. When infarction occurs in the territory of the posterior cerebral arteries, it is usually secondary to embolism, which refers to the lodging of an embolus, that is, any detached intravascular mass, which may be a blood clot, a fat globule or a gas bubble in the bloodstream, which can cause a blockage from lower segments of the vertebral brachycerebral system or heart. Clinical symptoms associated with occlusion of the posterior cerebral artery depend on the location of the occlusion and may include thalamic syndrome, thalamic perforate syndrome, which is strokes causing damage to the thalamus, Weber syndrome, which is a form of stroke characterized by the presence of an oculomotor nerve palsy, and contralateral hemiparesis or hemiplegia. Contralateral hemiplegia, that is paralysis of opposite side, Hymenopsia, that is loss of half of the visual field either in one eye or both eye, and a variety of other symptoms including color blindness, failure to see to and fro movements, verbal dyslexia and hallucinations. The most important finding is occipital lobe infarction leading to an opposite visual field defect. Neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters are endogenous chemicals that transmit signal from a neuron to a target cell across a synapse. There are many different ways to classify the neurotransmitters, dividing them into amino acids, peptides and monoamines is sufficient for some classification purposes. Major neurotransmitters are amino acids, for example glutamate, aspartate, D-serine, gamma aminobutyric acid which is also known as GABA, and glycerine. Monoamines and other biogenic amines includes dopamine which is also known as DA, norepinephrine also known as non-adrenaline, NE and NA, epinephrine which is also known as adrenaline, histamine, serotonin which is also known as SSE and 5-HT. Peptides, for example somatostatin, substance P, opioid peptides, and others are acetylcholine, adenosine, anandamide, nitric oxide, etc. By far, the most prevalent neurotransmitter is glutamate, which is excitatory as well over 90% of the synapses in the human brain. The next most prevalent is GABA, which is inhibitory at more than 90% of the synapses that do not use glutamate. The only direct action of a neurotransmitter is to activate a receptor. Therefore, the effects of a neurotransmitter system depend on the connections of the neurons that use the transmitter and the chemical properties of the receptors that the transmitter binds to. Here are a few examples of important neurotransmitter actions. Glutamate. Glutamate is used at the great majority of fast excitatory synapses in the brain and spinal cord. It is also used as most synapses that are modifiable, that is, capable of increasing or decreasing in strength. Modifiable synapses are thought to be the main memory storage elements in the brain. Excessive glutamate release can overstimulate the brain and lead to excitotoxicity, causing cell death resulting in seizures or strokes. Excitotoxicity has been implicated in certain chronic diseases including ischemic stroke, epilepsy, Alzheimer's disease, Huntington's disease and Parkinson's disease. Glutamate is also associated with learning and memory. Alzheimer's disease is first exhibited in symptoms related to memory. Now, GABA. GABA is used at the great majority of fast inhibitory synapses in virtually every part of the brain. Many sedative or tranquilizing drugs act by enhancing the effects of GABA. GABA also contributes to motor control, vision and many other cortical functions. GABA regulates anxiety. It is also used to treat epilepsy and to calm down the trembling of people suffering from Huntington's disease. Acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is distinguished as the transmitter at the neuromuscular junction connecting motor nerves to muscles. The paralytic arrow-poison carrier acts by blocking transmission at these synapses. Acetylcholine also operates in many regions of the brain but using different receptors, including nicotinic and muscarine receptors. It is widely distributed excitatory neurotransmitter. It triggers muscle contraction, stimulates the secretion of certain hormones. In the central nervous system, it is involved in wakefulness, attentiveness, anger, aggression, sexuality and thirst, among other things. Alzheimer's disease is also associated with a lack of acetylcholine in certain regions of the brain. Dopamine. Dopamine has a number of important functions in the brain. This includes regulation of motor behavior, pleasures related to motivation and also emotional arousal. It plays a critical role in reward system. People with Parkinson's disease have been linked to low levels of dopamine, and people with schizophrenia have been linked to high levels of dopamine. It modulates mood and plays a central role in positive reinforcement and dependency. The loss of dopamine in certain parts of the brain causes muscle rigidity, which is typical of Parkinson's disease. Serotonin. Serotonin is a monoamine neurotransmitter. Most of it is produced by and found in the intestine, approximately 90% of it, and the remainder in the central nervous system neurons. It functions to regulate appetite, sleep, memory and learning, temperature, mood, behavior, muscle contraction and function of the cardiovascular system and endocrine system. It is speculated to have a role in depression, as some depressed patients are seen to have lower concentration of metabolites of serotonin in their cerebrospinal fluid and brain tissue. Serotonin contributes to several functions such as regulating body temperature and pain, depression, suicide, impulsive behavior and aggressiveness seem to be related with certain imbalances in the level of serotonin. Substance P is a neuropeptide and functions as both a neurotransmitter and as a neuromodulator. It aids in controlling relaxation of the vasculature and lowering blood pressure through the release of nitric oxide. Opioid peptides are neurotransmitters that act within pain pathways and the emotional centers of the brain. Some of them are analgesics and elicit pleasure or euphoria. Norepinephrine. Norepinephrine is important for attentiveness, emotions, sleep, dreaming and learning. It is also released in the blood as a hormone. It is an integral part of the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. It also plays a role in mood disorders such as manic depressive psychosis. Now, the neurotransmitter system. Neurons expressing certain types of neurotransmitters sometimes form distinct systems where activation of the system affects large volumes of the brain called volume transmission. Major neurotransmitter systems include the noradrenergic, norepinephrine system, the dopamine system, the serotonin system and the cholinergic system. Best known neurotransmitters that are involved in many functions in both the central and the peripheral nervous system include, apart from acetylcholine, others that belong to the family of amines and amino acids. Norepinephrine system. Norepinephrine system. The noradrenergic neurons in the brain form a neurotransmitter system that, when activated, exerts effects on large areas of the brain. The effects are alertness and arousal and influences on the reward system. The non-adrenergic neurons originate both in the locus coeruleus of pons and the lateral tegmental field. The axons of the neurons in the locus coeruleus act on adrenergic receptors of the following structures: amygdala, cingulate gyrus, cingulum, hippocampus, hypothalamus, neocortex, spinal cord, striatum, thalamus, some brainstem nuclei, and the cerebellum. On the other hand, axons of the neurons of the lateral tegmental field act on adrenergic receptors in hypothalamus. For example, the structure explains some of the clinical uses of norepinephrine, since a modification of the system affects large areas of the brain. Some of the noradrenergic agents are indicated as useful for treating certain disorders. Norepinephrine may be used for the indications attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, depression, and hypotension and schizophrenia. Norepinephrine, like other catecholamines, cannot cross the blood-brain barrier, so drugs such as amphetamines are necessary to increase brain. Different medications affecting norepinephrine function have their targets at different points in the mechanism. From synthesis to signal termination, some of their regular functions are as follows: to function as synthesis modulators, vesicular transport modulators, release modulators, termination modulators, and as anti-inflammatory agent role in Alzheimer's disease. The norepinephrine from locus coeruleus cells, in addition to its neurotransmitter role, locally diffuses from varicocytes, such as it provides an endogenous anti-inflammatory agent in microenvironment around the neurons. Up to 70% of norepinephrine projecting cells are lost in Alzheimer's disease. Now, the dopamine system. The dopamine system is basically a group of nerve cells, most of which originate in the midbrain. They send their axons to the forebrain, to different parts of the forebrain where they plug into particular functions. To simplify things, there are three main branches of this forebrain dopamine system. There is a branch that goes all the way to the frontal cortex, where it modulates cognitive function and enhances the efficiency of certain forms of thinking and working memory. There is a very famous branch which goes to a structure called striatum, which is implicated in Parkinson's disease. Here, dopamine is involved in facilitating movements. So, in Parkinson's disease, when you lose dopamine, your movements become rigid and rather reduced in number and amplitude. The third important branch of the dopamine system is that it goes through structures in the limbic system of the brain, which is the emotional center of the brain, including the nucleus accumbens, which has often been called the reward center. Many drugs of abuse exert their effects directly or sometimes directly through this reward dopamine system. In general, the dopamine system may work as one thing. It may work to prepare you for thinking, for movement and for reward, and that's its main function. It functions in anticipation of behavioral and cognitive output. The serotonin system. One of the systems in the brain that has been studied most in depression has been the serotonin system. A reason for that has been that drugs that would act relatively specifically in the serotonin system as their primary mechanism of action had antidepressant effects in humans who suffered from depression. So, for example, most antidepressant drugs that are prescribed now are serotonin reuptake inhibitors. They block the reuptake of serotonin into cells that release serotonin and ultimately increase the transmission of serotonin to some of the serotonin receptors. It's thought that that probably is leading to some cascade of other events that may become particularly relevant in depression, but nevertheless, the serotonin system in general has been shown to play important roles in modulating stress and coping with stress, and modulating emotional behavior in general. It is thought that this system, if you have abnormalities of function within this system that may arise, for example, due to genetic mutations or other kinds of impairments. If you have an impairment of the system, it may interfere with your ability to deal with stressful situations, or it may interfere with your ability to respond to antidepressant treatments. Cholinergic system. The cholinergic system comes as two main branches. It is a fascinating system because there is a forebrain system in the so-called basal forebrain that is right out front of the bottom. That projects to the neocortex, and another branch of it projects to the hippocampus. These areas of the basal forebrain, these cholinergic cells are involved in particular in a form of arousal we call vigilance. They are greatly involved in enhancing signal to noise ratios so that they enable you to detect targets with great fidelity. We also suspect that they contribute to memory encoding processes and working memory processes mainly by enhancing the power of the signals going into these processes. There is also a brainstem cholinergic system which actually also stimulates the basal forebrain system. The brainstem is called the tegmental cholinergic system and is very importantly involved in the sleep-waking cycle. The effects of neurochemicals on feelings, emotions and mood. The four main neurochemicals in the brain that affect our feelings, thoughts, emotions and mood. Serotonin. Serotonin can become depleted with chronic stress and anxiety, which will leave you feeling depressed, irritable and exhausted. Good serotonin foods are turkey, spinach, whole grain, fish, nuts, beans, brown rice, beets, bananas and blueberries. Epinephrine is responsible for the flight or fight response. Epinephrine reflects the growing amounts of stress felt in today's fast-paced world, from rush hour traffic to racing to beat the clock. The neurotoxin affects the heart rate, blood pressure and nervous system and has to do with injury repair and sleeping. Many people experience depletion of epinephrine with chronic stress or anxiety, leaving you feel worn out, exhausted, mentally drained and often depressed. Good epinephrine foods are almonds, avocados, bananas, most leafy greens, lean meat, grains, pineapple, and tofu. Dopamine, it affects sleeping and waking cycles. Dopamine can become depleted with chronic stress, anxiety and intense trauma and is affected by serotonin levels. Dopamine and serotonin are very much linked. Commonly described as jet lag, its depletion disrupts unnatural circadian rhythms. Good dopamine foods are apple, banana, beets, chicken, eggs, watermelon, fish, wheat germ, beans and cottage cheese. Endorphin, they are the body's natural painkillers. They are responsible for decrease in physical pain, that is the runner's high. Alcohol abuse can deplete endorphins and their response to exercise. Good endorphin foods are strawberries, banana, grape, oranges, nuts, sesame seeds and pasta. The brain consists of three major parts: cerebrum, cerebellum and brainstem. Blood supply to brain is by three primary blood vessels: anterior, posterior and middle cerebral artery. Carotid and vertebral arteries form the circle of Willis. Major neurotransmitters are glutamate, GABA, acetylcholine, dopamine, serotonin and norepinephrine. Major neurotransmitter systems are norepinephrine, dopamine, serotonin and cholinergic system, each having their distinct functions. Thank you.